So just to backtrack a little bit, we heard about the scenarios, and I thought maybe we'd like to just kickstart just from the audience. There's two representatives one from the power sector and one from the aviation industry, and I'd like to hear their responses on Shell's blueprint and how actually, how implementable is it, and what are the challenges that are being faced today? So perhaps we can start with Peter Littlewood from CLP.
Thanks. I'm not a physicist or an economist. I build power stations, and many of them are coal-fired, so we count as climate criminals as well. But we are trying to change that, and of course it's very interesting to hear about the scenarios for the future, the analogies from the past, the projections, whatever. The issue is what are we going to do now? What action can we take? And to me, there are two possible scenarios to use the Shell approach. One is that we carry on the way we are, and at the moment we're trying to build wind turbines and solar plants and hydro plants all around Asia. At this rate, we can replace a few % of our fossil-fired energy every few years. Just a rough guideline. That's about the rate at which we can do it. It's a slow process, and if we carry on at that rate, then I think we're onto one of these scenarios that the last speaker here has just described as to the worldwide chaos, effectively. We could do much more. We could build more wind farms, more solar plants. We could build nuclear plants, whatever. But there are certain things we need to be able to do that. We need land, and that's up to governments to provide. We need technology. That's available. All these areas are very active technology. Many companies are developing wind turbines, solar panels. Capital, well, we'll provide that. We're the investor. We will provide the capital. But the thing that's missing is some value to be put on renewable energy as opposed to conventional fossil-fired energy. And whether it's a tax or whether it's a cap and trade, I don't care. The problem at the moment is there's nothing. And therefore, we can only develop a wind farm if we're given a special price for our electricity. And that's not a sustainable approach. So we could go much faster than a few % every few years. We could accelerate the whole development of renewable energy. But we need something from governments now. And that is some way of putting a value on clean energy, on renewable energy. That's all we need. Don't try and micromanage how we do it. Just put that in place. That's all we need. Leave the rest to us. We're the industry. We've got the capital. We'll do it. And I suppose my question is, do you see any prospect of that happening in the near future? Are governments ever going to take any action on this? Thank you.
This is on? Good. Thank you very much. Clearly, I share many of your views, and you could see that the blueprint's outlook, one of the factors within it is that there is carbon pricing that emerges in the period 2012 to 2015. It's not universal, but indeed I share the views of Dr. Sandor and others about this patchwork of developments. But it does mean that between 2012 and 2015, you need to have a strong enough patchwork that is really beginning to shape the investments that are taking place. And it can happen. We believe that that outlook is feasible. We don't believe that it's necessarily going to come from any kind of 192 cats in the United Nations being herded in one direction. We do believe it's more likely to emerge the way that we spoke about. But it is not inevitable that it happens. And so we all have a role to play in being very clear about that need for a pricing signal. The way I think about it, I'm like you, I'm a practitioner. We build stuff. I like to think of ourselves as being in the body politic, we're the legs and the arms. We do stuff, but the head, we have collectively decided that the brain is what the decisions are made by our government institutions. And so clearly we do need the government institutions to be adopting these important signals. And I do see progress there. So it's not necessarily a scramble world, but it is not moving even as quickly as the blueprints world that I sketched out.
Okay, I know there's already a couple of hands. Just before I start taking those questions, I'd like to just ask Dr. Mark Watson just to provide his view from the aviation industry, which is now embroiled in actually emissions trading, as well as trying to figure out what are the new technologies and fuel mix and options that you actually have.
Yeah, thank you. I think Jeremy's scenarios from Shell actually really are quite thought-provoking and actually resonate very clearly with where we are within aviation internationally. We see evidence that we are trying desperately to transition from a world around the scramble kind of scenario to one it's more of blueprints, and we're seeing both of these things taking place. At the moment, we obviously as carriers are competing for a dwindling supply of resources. We are reliant on hydrocarbons. We're desperately trying to accelerate the rate of biofuels into our fleet. Technology is not able to deliver quickly enough for us. And that really throws us into a debate about economic measures. So the conversation earlier around emissions trading versus taxes is one that we've been heavily involved in. I would say that, in amongst the work that we're trying to do on trying to be masters of our own destiny by trying to reduce our overall emissions and to try and move towards a carbon neutral pathway and to reduce emissions by 50% by 2050, we are somewhat constrained by the regulatory frameworks that we operate in. And certainly, we've called and we've looked and we've been frustrated by what we've seen coming out of the UN, particularly through COP15 and also through our own UN body, ICAO, in terms of just not being able to get their act together between developed and developing countries, all of which have a role to play here. And, particularly developing countries, given the scale of growth in aviation in emerging economies. But, what we need in aviation is we need a global sectoral approach. We need a global system to regulate emissions. We need that to be equitable. We do need to have a fair price, market price on carbon. We need deep and we need comprehensive carbon markets, and we are way away from that. As Jeannie was saying, at the moment we have a scheme in Europe which we will go into in 2012, and that's focusing our minds as airlines about how on earth we deal with carbon and carbon management and carbon trading. But it will nonetheless, I think, incentivize improvements in the industry. It's not a perfect scheme, but I think it will actually take us in the direction that we want. And I think it will lead to more incentives around new technology and indeed accelerate biofuels. But for an aviation industry which is truly global in nature, regional approaches, a patchwork of approaches, which we're seeing with the US, Australia, Japan, Germany, increased taxes in the UK, Austria, etc., that is counterproductive. It doesn't help us, it doesn't help our passengers, and it, most importantly, and this is the point that wasn't made, is that taxes are very rarely hypothecated. They very rarely go to environmental improvement projects, whereas emissions trading can be hypothecated to actually fund investment in R&D and to make improvements on the ground, which is where we need to be at the moment. So it's a really stimulating debate, and thanks very much.
Okay, so I had a lady in the front on the third row. First, yeah.
I'm Cornelia Poschka. I'm from the Berlin government, and I'm here for the C40 group. So I will speak on the 5th. What I mean is that we spoke a lot about global activities and the activities of the industry, but I think we should not forget that we could only achieve a success in climate protection if we do more on the local level, and that's what C40 is promoting. The major cities are working together to help each other to improve energy efficiency and CO2 reduction on the local level. And I think this should be promoted much more, and then we can achieve a better success than if the nations sit together, because Cancun won't bring any progress, I think.
Okay, if you could pass your mic to the gentleman in front of you, and then we'll have great Gabriel afterwards.
Thanks for the opportunity. My name is Houston. I came from Beijing. And actually, I'm working in a global youth network with focus on encouraging young people's entrepreneurship on sustainability and the climate change issue. So I would like to give a comment to Mr. John. I really appreciate your speech with the big picture that everybody should look on. And I see that you mentioned in the past few decades that there are more than 2.5 billion people population created, but there's very, very much less proportion for the job created. And from our perspective as a younger generation, we have clearly see that lots of young people, their potential is not fully discovered at the age of 25 or to 30. And there are so many things to do on water, on climate change, and different kind of issues. So what do you see a role the current leaders or leaders of today or the organizations who have lots of resources today, what's their responsibilities and their benefits or opportunities they can play to encourage the young people's entrepreneurship and the young people's innovation on sustainability and climate change issue? And this question is also open for other panelists. Thanks.
Thank you very much. First of all, am I still mic here or no? I guess it goes. Thanks for your point. It's really good to hear the young people speak out because you are the future. This is the world we're giving you, like it or not. I once gave a speech at my son's college, and he introduced me as someone who's been working to make the world a better, safer, and better place for 30 years. And he said, "Nice job, Dad." So we fully, with humility, look at the world we're giving you and say we've done our best, perhaps, but we should have done better. I think the first answer to that question would be not waiting for a government or someone else to tell you, but for you to see something, to take the initiative and to do it. And a lot of that's happening. There's tremendous. Here in China, there's huge entrepreneurialism. I think it's very impressive to everybody. There's a lot you can do. And maybe you and others using the instant communications and all start creating networks of people that focus around some of these larger problems and begin to think innovatively of how to create. Because innovation is a big part of the answer, right? It's about how we're going to do it. So if you say, for example, let's say we know that we're coming to the point where millions of people are going to be forced to move. And everyone says, "Oh my goodness, that's terrible." Well, I don't know. Can you and 50 people like you around the world begin to think, and maybe you can create a business out of that, or maybe you can do something which will begin to do it. So I think the other problem with governments is most governments, at least that I work with around the world, and I spend 80% of my time outside the West. So I think most of what I hear from everybody, from whether it's Washington or Europe or wherever, all governments today it's very hard to govern today. It's extremely difficult for anybody to govern with everything that's going on in the world. Everything's hyper-connected and moving very, very fast. And I think a very big part of most governments seem to be more firefighting departments, fire departments, than they are being able to anticipate. Now, there's exceptions, and China is very much one of them. But I still think the idea of you, people like yourself, taking this and saying, how do I want to deal with some of these problems that are here? That's the way solutions are going to be found.
Jeremy, from the industry, of course.
I couldn't agree more. As a company, we ourselves have a number of different programs to help support entrepreneurial activity. But clearly, many of those are, I think, correctly focused on developing education and scientific education and engineering development of young people who can have a practical impact in the areas that you're speaking of. So couldn't agree more. Indeed, as my generation is in position now to hand on to you the problems, I do hope that in the remaining time that we have to have an influence, we can help hand over to you some of the solutions as well.